It's 20-8. A coroner has warned an Ofsted inspection lacked fairness, respect and sensitivity and was likely to have contributed to the death of head teacher Ruth Perry. Ruth was 53. She took her own life in January this year after learning her school in Reading was to be downgraded to inadequate. Ofsted has apologised and says it is already making changes. Ruth's sister, Julia Waters, joins us now. Morning, Julia.
Morning.
What did yesterday's inquest ruling mean for you?
Clearly, it was a very bittersweet day. There's no positive, triumphant sort of conclusion that can come out of an inquest, but we were vindicated, I think, is the main message. What we have been saying loud and clear for the last 11 months, it's 11 months today since Ruth took her life, is that Ofsted inspection was directly responsible for Ruth's death. Ofsted have repeatedly tried to deny that over the year, including on public media. But yesterday, the coroner's findings confirm what we have known all along. So it validated, vindicated our argument, and I hope that the recommendations that the coroner has made will help to prevent what happened to Ruth from ever happening again.
Well, that's the thing, isn't it? As you say, very difficult to take positives out of an awful situation like this. But what would you like to see happen now and in the future?
Well, Amanda Spielman has put out a statement, as you say, apologising for the distress, not apologising for the inspection causing my sister's death. She has promised to make more changes, but they are, again, woefully insufficient. 1 day's training next week for lead inspectors, when allegedly they've been training inspectors on how to deal with head teacher stress always and centrally, is just not enough. I have no confidence at all that the current leadership and management of Ofsted are capable or willing to make the profound changes to their systems and culture that are needed to make the inspections fit for purpose and safe. But I very much hope that the new chief inspector, who starts in the new year, will be conscious of the extent of the reforms that are needed. And I'm very happy to work with him and to continue to work with the Secretary of State to ensure that really, really profound changes are made.
Would you get rid of inspections entirely in their current form?
No, in their current form, I wouldn't get rid of inspections. I don't think anybody in the teaching profession, any parent of school-aged children, would ever argue that schools shouldn't be accountable, and inspections can play a part in that accountability and making sure children are well educated and safe. But the current inspection system isn't working. It's unreliable, it's inconsistent, it doesn't provide parents with an accurate view of the strengths and weaknesses of their children's schools, and many of the mechanisms of the current system are profoundly dangerous for the mental and physical well-being of teachers and school leaders.
Is it the single word assessment that is a big part of the problem here?
The single word judgment is clearly deficient and dangerous, and it's the one thing that I think everybody who's calling for change can see is wrong and unhelpful and needs to go and should have gone already. It's not the only thing, but it is a very obvious, easy thing to fix. You remove the single word judgment and it removes a whole lot of the other pressures that flow from that judgment. But there are other things that need to change too.
Were you aware at the time that Ruth was struggling so much with this inspection?
With the inspection itself, well, I didn't see Ruth. I did text her. We were trying to organise something for that weekend, and had been texting each other about it, and then she suddenly stopped texting me. But that does happen. She has a busy job. I have a busy job. So I wasn't aware at the time, but I saw her the day after the inspection. She popped round, and you could just see the impact. She was different. She was never the same again.
Do you feel like the people who are charged with running these inspections just need much more extensive training and coaching on how to manage the people that they are dealing with?
If I pick up on what you say, that yes, they definitely need that. They don't just need that. I mean, something that obviously I have seen all of the disclosure evidence from the inquest, and a lot of it which hasn't been made public, and so I can't discuss. I have seen Ofsted's training materials from last year. I've seen Ofsted's training materials for this year, and I was genuinely, despite my already low opinion of Ofsted systems, I was genuinely shocked at how shoddy and unprofessional they were, how they lack rigour, how they're not backed up by research, by proper expertise. And I feel that those inspectors are being sent into schools woefully ill-equipped for the job. So actually, Ofsted, I have been arguing that Ofsted ought to have a duty of care to those it inspects. It does have a duty of care to its inspectors, and I don't think that Ofsted is fulfilling that duty of care to its inspectors. Their whole framework is shoddy, inconsistent, unreliable. The recruitment is deficient. The training is deficient. The checks and balances on individual inspectors or across different inspections is deficient. I started this campaign, if you like, in inverted commas, with an idea about the elements of the current inspection framework which are dangerous, such as the single word judgment. I emerge from my sister's inquest with an even lower opinion of Ofsted than I had before, if that was possible. The extent of the changes that are needed to the systems, to the culture, to the leadership are so widespread and so profound. It's time to completely rethink, scrap the system, start again, rebuild an inspection system that's fit for purpose, that's rigorous, that's clear, that has the confidence of the teaching profession and of parents. That's what's needed, not a few tweaks around the edges as have been offered so far.
Thanks so much for speaking to us this morning. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
That's Ruth Perry's sister, Julia Waters. The Chief Inspector of Ofsted, Amanda Spillman, has given quite a long statement. I'll read a section of it now. After Miss Perry's death, we made changes to the way we work to help reduce the pressure felt by school leaders. We will do more. The coroner highlighted a number of areas of concern. We'll work hard to address each of these as soon as we can, and we're starting that work straight away. We've started to develop training for all inspectors on recognising and responding to visible signs of anxiety. As a first step, we'll delay our inspections next week by a day so we can bring all of our lead school inspectors together ahead of further school inspections. As well as addressing the issue of anxiety, we'll be clear with inspectors what to do if a pause is needed. She goes on to say, from next week we'll provide all schools with a number to call if they have concerns about their inspection. This will put them directly in touch with someone senior from Ofsted. You can see more on this story on The Death of a Head, which is available on BBC iPlayer If you've been affected by any of the issues mentioned in this discussion, you can find support at bbc.co.uk/action line. It's 10 to 8.
An Ofsted inspection contributed to the death of head teacher Ruth Perry. That's the conclusion of Senior Coroner Heidi Connor, delivered yesterday following a 5-day inquest in which she heard from family members, school colleagues, the Ofsted inspectors and medical professionals. This is the first time Ofsted has been listed as a contributing factor in the death of a head teacher. Ruth Perry had been head of Caversham Primary School in Berkshire for 13 years when she took her own life in January, ahead of an inspection report being made public which had downgraded the school from outstanding to inadequate based on safeguarding concerns. The school was regraded this summer to good. Her death ignited a national debate about the mental health of school leaders. Ofsted Chief Inspector Amanda Spielman has apologised for the distress that Mrs Perry undoubtedly experienced as a result of our inspection and said that Ofsted was making several changes to help reduce the pressure felt by school leaders. Well, I'm joined now by Ruth Perry's sister, Professor Julia Waters. Julia, thank you so much for taking the time to speak to us here on Woman's Hour. I'd like to start by getting your reaction to the coroner's verdict that an Ofsted inspection likely contributed to Ruth's death.
Thank you for having me on this morning. Clearly, there's no outcome from an inquest that's a positive one, if you like, but we were relieved and pleased that the coroner came to the conclusion she came to, the conclusion that everyone who knew Ruth knew already. Ruth wasn't the first head teacher or teacher to take her life after an Ofsted inspection, but as you said, it is the first time that an Ofsted inspection has actually been included on the coroner's form as linked to Ruth's death. And actually, as far as we're concerned, it was the reason for Ruth's death. So I'm hoping that the fact that that has been publicly and officially, legally acknowledged will finally make Ofsted make the changes that are needed to make the inspection system reliable, consistent and safe.
I'd like to pick out some other bits of what the coroner concluded and just to get your thoughts. And they said that parts of the inspection lacked fairness, respect and sensitivity, and that it was at times rude and intimidating. I mean, that must have been incredibly difficult to hear.
Well, it was difficult to hear, but obviously I had heard that from Ruth herself last year. I suppose I've read all of the disclosure evidence that was submitted to the coroner in detail, so that having seen that evidence from all parties, it confirmed, but with such brutal realism, what Ruth had already told us. There was always, I suppose, that niggling doubt that maybe it was just Ruth who'd perceived that inspection to be as it was. But her colleagues who were there not only witnessed the terrible impact it had on Ruth, but were also profoundly upset and traumatized by the experience themselves. And to read their testimony, to hear them in court talking about the sustained, painful levels of stress that they were all under during that inspection, the unpleasant experience of meetings with the inspectors, confirmed kind of what I suspected and knew already, that there was something just profoundly wrong with the way that inspection was conducted, but actually with a system that allows there to be inspections like that.
Well, and the evidence also revealed very little training for inspectors to identify and deal with anxiety and distress in school leaders. But Ofsted say that they're now started to develop training for all the inspectors on recognising and responding to visible signs of anxiety. Is it enough?
No. I mean, the National Director for Education, Christopher Russell, gave evidence at the inquest, during which he repeatedly claimed that Ofsted had always been very conscious of the stress that inspections cause and had included training for inspectors in its training materials as sort of central to their training materials. The untruth of that was exposed in the inquest. The coroner asked Ofsted to produce these training materials. So I, like the coroner, have seen both the training materials that were used at the time of the inspection at Caversham Primary this time last year, and the training materials that have been used since the beginning of this school year, which allegedly have brought in changes. All they have done is sort of pay lip service to the fact that inspections can be stressful, asking questions like, how could you get this information while minimizing stress and anxiety? But there's no rigorous, useful guide either to spotting signs of anxiety or how to respond to it, or what options might be open either to the inspectors or to school staff if stress and anxiety are detected. And in Ruth's case, the inspectors themselves identified it's in their evidence. Absolutely horrifying to read some of the accounts that they themselves have of Ruth's response in meetings. They saw that she was distressed. Her colleagues knew she was distressed, but there was nothing was done to adapt the inspection to that, to accommodate that. Nobody was aware of this mythical creature, as the coroner called it, of the option to pause an inspection, for instance. So, sorry, a long answer to your question. The training that is in place now, that was in place a year ago, is woefully inadequate to cope with the stress that Ofsted themselves acknowledge is caused by inspections. And Amanda Spielman's suggestion yesterday, in response to those utterly damning conclusions of the coroner that they're going to do a day's training next week to train their inspectors. Come on. I think anybody can see that's just inadequate. Something far more fundamental is required than that.
We will be coming to Ofsted's response to this as well, but there's something else that I'd like to get your thoughts on that was highlighted by the coroner, and that was the rule of confidentiality that was in place at the time, which meant that Ruth could have talked to other head teacher friends about the report. Well, she couldn't talk to other head teacher friends. So there was this whole network of supporting women and supported women that she could have leaned on, but she wasn't allowed to.
No, it was very clear in the guidance what she and her colleagues were told during the inspection, what was written in the most stark terms on the draft report. If you share any of the information from this draft report, it will be considered a serious breach of confidentiality and action will be taken. I can't remember the exact words, but that was the tone, that was the gist. So particularly in a small primary school, Caversham Primary is a small primary school. The senior leadership team is 4 people. 2 of those were the deputy heads who sort of were part-time. So, in a school, it could be just 3 people who were themselves part of that inspection, who themselves were traumatized by that inspection. The idea that the only people Ruth was allowed to share that outcome with were her senior leadership team, the chair of governors, and the local authority. I'm sure anyone can see, we've talked a lot, I've been talking a lot about the power imbalance within the Ofsted system, the education system. But clearly here, the only people Ruth was allowed to discuss the inspection result with were her employers, or the staff whom she led and who were looking to her for leadership and guidance, who themselves were traumatized by that inspection. So actually, the people it would have been helpful for her to talk to, absolutely, her wonderful, wonderful colleagues, Reading head teachers, whom I've come to know this last year, didn't know before. She wasn't able to discuss it with them, the people who, more than anyone, really could understand what it felt like and might have been able to offer her both emotional and practical support.
They've changed that rule now. Are you satisfied?
They've kind of changed it. As the coroner said, there are still elements of that. They have loosened the confidentiality requirement, but they have still not made explicit, for instance, that a head teacher can share that outcome with medical professionals. I mean, looking through the evidence of Ruth reaching out to her GP, to mental health services, and even then she felt unable to name the school, to talk about what that judgment was, even when seeking medical help. So the coroner has pointed out that yes, there have been improvements. Ofsted have not just clarified matters, which is what they were trying to argue. They have changed the policy, having, thank goodness, recognised that confidentiality requirement was inhumane. But there are still elements of clarification that are needed to lift that particular burden from head teachers.
Now, the coroner also pointed to the current Ofsted system, which allows for the single word judgment of inadequate to be applied equally to a school rated otherwise good, but with issues which could be remedied by the time the report was published, as to a school which is dreadful in all respects. Do you think single phrase judgments will change?
I sincerely hope so. It has been one of, if not the sticking point. I've had many meetings now, long meetings with the Secretary of State and the Department for Education. And we've had some tense moments when we're both kind of saying, that's our red line. So it's, government policy, that's, this is how they judge not just schools, but care homes, hospitals, GP practices, and so on. And they're not going to budge. And I, on the other hand, and it seems the most of the teaching profession arguing that without removing those single word judgments, many of the other tweaks that have been offered so far will be ineffective. That's the one thing that would be easy to change and would make the most difference in one fell swoop. Get rid of the single word judgment, and then many of the other issues around that sort of public shaming, the humiliation.
Because that one word, inadequate, that loomed large, didn't it, for Ruth?
Oh, God, yeah. Oh, God. I mean, it's not just that it's one word, it's that word. That word. I mean, I work in education myself, higher education. We have accountability systems and reviews and so on as well. But the idea that in education it is ever acceptable to use that word, inadequate, to sum something up. If I wrote on an undergraduate essay at the end of it, inadequate, however shoddy I might personally think their work was, I would get shot down. That would not be allowed. And rightly so. How can you sum up, one undergraduate essay, one student essay with the word inadequate, let alone a whole school? And as Ruth felt, her whole career, her vocation, sort of destroyed with one word and with that word.
I am going to just read out the Ofsted statement from the Chief Inspector, Amanda Spielman. She said, Ruth Perry's death was a tragedy that deeply affected many people. My thoughts remain with her family, the wider Caversham school community and everyone else who knew and loved her. On behalf of Ofsted, I would like to say sorry to them for the distress that Mrs. Perry undoubtedly experienced as a result of our inspection. After Mrs. Perry's death, we made changes to the way we work to help reduce the pressure felt by school leaders. We will do more. The coroner highlighted a number of areas of concern. We will work hard to address each of these as soon as we can, and we're starting that work straight away. The inquest heard about the pressures Ruth felt, and that she articulated in the time after the inspection and before her death, not only about how to face her staff and the parents after the downgrading, but also worrying about wider repercussions that that word, the inadequate judgment, would have had. For example, local house prices potentially falling in the area. Just huge weight of responsibility. The last time you saw her alive was on Christmas Day. How did she seem to you then?
She was haunted. I mean, she really was, from the very start of that inspection until her death. She was complete. She could think of nothing else. So she was trying very hard to put on a brave face, but it was very unconvincing. Her children were there, my children were there. We wanted to have a fun family Christmas, and we did our best, but Ruth's heart wasn't in it, and it was very difficult for all of us.
I think we need to talk. Sorry. I know it's difficult. I just would like to talk about the woman behind the headlines. What was she like?
She was lovely. She was lovely. She was a very human, unpretentious, genuine person. She had no front. She went into education because she liked to do good, because she liked to nurture children. I mean, she had a very holistic attitude to children's education, not just the curriculum and knowledge, but actually thinking about their broader development and creativity and extracurricular activities. She was she was a friend to so many people. I mean, I think being a head teacher is a very, very hard, isolating job. And I think there were probably times when Ruth just wanted to be a mum like everybody else and just, live in the community like everybody else. But being a head teacher always comes to that sort of level of responsibility and local celebrity even, that everybody knew her. So, but I think everybody knew her as a genuinely kind, well-meaning, hardworking, successful person. And this is what's just so shocking about what happened to Ruth, that an inspection of a school that everybody locally knows is an absolutely excellent school, that an inspection of that school could reduce my happy, healthy, successful sister to such depth of despair. She could see no way out. It's just a terrible indictment of a system that's meant to raise standards, improve lives.
And she was married and had 2 daughters, and you've taken on a huge level of responsibility as well as her sister. No doubt the death was devastating for the whole family, but you're dealing with all of this and your own grief.
Yeah, it's not easy. I do think sometimes the fact that I have, it's not that I've decided to do this, to sort of campaign, for a want of a better word. I don't feel like I have any choice. It's something I have to do. Something was so terribly wrong with what happened to Ruth, but within that system that I have to do this to put it right. But just because I can still speak with clarity about what happened and my analysis of what is so wrong with the system and responses to my calls for change. That doesn't matter that doesn't mean that it's not hard. It doesn't mean that I'm not still grieving. And on some levels, there's a lot of grief that still needs to come out. That a lot of my grief is still on hold because of doing this. It's added an extra burden, an extra layer of complication. But it has to be done.
Is there anything you'd like to say about Amanda Spielman's comments on this programme 2 weeks ago?
I can't say I was surprised. Amanda Spielman hasn't spoken often publicly, but every time she has displayed a staggering lack of emotional intelligence.
Can I just say what she said to Emma? She said there was a very sad case in the spring which has been used as a pivot to try and discredit what we do. The quality of what we do underneath has been solid for years. We have really strong feedback on our inspection framework.
I expect they're getting some strong feedback now. Yes, I heard that. I heard it live. As I was just saying to you, the fact that I have been speaking on the media doesn't mean that I'm not still struggling with my grief. And actually hearing Amanda Spielman speak on Women's Hour was the first time that I have actually screamed. I have a grief counsellor who said, if you need to, scream. And I screamed loud and long. And it wasn't, expletive-laden outburst at the crass insensitivity of what she did. It felt visceral. It felt painful. I really hope my parents weren't listening. They listened to Radio 4. I really hope they weren't listening then. It was such a kick in the guts. And just a few days before the inquest starts, and here she is again in the public media, casting aspersions on me, on those like me who can see there's something wrong with the inspection system, suggesting that Ruth's death's been used as a pivot to discredit Ofsted. I mean, it's outrageous. Ofsted are doing a very good job at discrediting themselves. They don't need us to come along and do that. Ruth's death was a direct result of an Ofsted inspection. I've been trying for the last 11 months, it's 11 months ago today that Ruth took her own life, to point out the fatal flaws in Ofsted's inspection system and been ignored. And that the chief inspector herself can go on, use her public voice and public platform to make such a crass and outrageous claim is just unacceptable.
Well, there's a new chief inspector starting in January, Sir Martin Oliver. What's your message to him?
I have a meeting in the diary to meet him very first week of his appointment in January. I very much hope that he is conscious of the massive challenge he's facing. What is needed to respond not just to my sister's death, as though that isn't terrible and devastating enough, but to the mental health crisis in the teaching profession, which has exposed the outpouring of anger and upset and rage against Ofsted. I hope that the new chief inspector understands the strength of feeling and the need for massive change, not just for tweaks.
And I have to ask, how are you all?
We're struggling. We're getting by. We're generally a resilient bunch, so we're managing, but it's hard. And Ruth's loss is immense to all of us. And it's something that can't be filled. and we just have to find some way of moving on. And a neighbour spoke to me quite soon after I first spoke out. A lovely neighbour who'd lost her son in quite traumatic circumstances, and she said to me, I think the one word of advice that has been most meaningful, and she just said, "Life has a way of pulling you forward," and that's just what it feels now. Life just pulls us forward, pulls us further away from that, and. But it's why it's so important that we ensure that things change so that no other family has to go through this.
Julia, I would like to thank you very much for speaking to me this morning on Woman's Hour. Thank you. That was Ruth Perry's sister, Professor Julia Waters. 84844 is the number to text with anything you'd like to talk to me about on the programme that you're hearing this morning. I am going to read out the statement from the Education Secretary, Gillian Keegan. She said, "My heart goes out to Ruth's family, friends and the school community. Her death was a tragedy that not only shocked the local community, but also the wider sector and beyond. It's clear from the coroner's findings that lessons need to be learned. We've worked closely with Ruth's family as well as with OFSTED to introduce key reforms and further support for our school leaders. I'm extremely grateful to Ruth's sister, Julia, and her friends for working so closely with us to introduce these changes. OFSTED is fundamental to making sure children are safe and receive the education they deserve. Together, we will look closely at the coroner's recommendations to consider further changes to make sure we have an inspection system that supports schools and teachers."
It's 8 o'clock. This is the UK Tonight. The school's watchdog Ofsted apologises today after an inquest concluded one of its inspections had likely contributed to the death of a head teacher. Ruth Perry took her own life in January after her school in Reading was rated inadequate. Tonight, we'll be joined by a parent of 4 children from the school who knew Ruth personally for more than a decade. Also to come, absolutely absurd. That's Boris Johnson's verdict on the coverage of Partygate as he appeared in front of the COVID inquiry for a second day. The former Prime Minister also insisted he didn't back a let-it-rip approach to the virus. Tonight, I'm going to be joined by 3 people with different personal experiences of the government's handling of the pandemic to see what they made of Boris Johnson's evidence today. Plus, remembering the voice of the pioneering poet and writer, Benjamin Zephaniah.
I've counted since that fire burned the many lessons I have learned. You have to talk to me and not the skin that holds me in. I took the wisdom that I got to make sure that I win. I'm counting weekly.
And never mind Paris or New York, the great and the good of the fashion world have descended on Manchester tonight as Chanel brings its catwalk to the streets of the city's northern quarter. All that to come and much more on the UK Tonight. Now, in January of this year, head teacher Ruth Perry took her own life. Afterwards, it emerged that the school she ran had just received a rating of inadequate from the school's inspector, OFSTED. At the time, there was great concern over the impact of these one-word ratings. Well, today, a coroner ruled that OFSTED's report was not only rude and intimidating, but also carried out by poorly trained staff, and that report had likely contributed to Ruth's death. After the verdict, Ofsted apologised, but Ruth's sister Julia said that urgent lessons must now be learned. Sadia Chowdhury was at the conclusion of the inquest for us today in Reading and has tonight's first report.
An Ofsted inspection blamed as a likely contributor to this head teacher's decision to end her own life. Ruth Perry died in January this year. Today, her family listened as a coroner ruled her death could have been the result of stress caused by the inspection.
The inquest into Ruth's death has shown the brutal inhumanity of the system of Ofsted inspections. Ofsted likes to judge people with single-word labels. We could judge the current Ofsted system with our own labels: callous, perverse, inhumane.
Ruth Perry's suicide came after Ofsted moved Caversham Primary School from its highest rating to its lowest over safeguarding concerns. The officer who led the inspection at the school that day told the inquest here at Berkshire Coroner's Court that Mrs. Perry had been tearful and kept saying, "It's not looking good, is it?" At the time, Ofsted inspectors had no specific guidance on what to do if a head teacher was stressed during an inspection. There was just one reference in the guidance urging them to take reasonable steps to prevent anxiety. Today, in a statement, Ofsted said, "We have started to develop training for all inspectors on recognising and responding to visible signs of anxiety. As a first step, we will delay our inspections next week by a day so we can bring all our lead school inspectors together ahead of further school inspections. As well as addressing the issue of anxiety, we will be clear with inspectors what to do if a pause is needed." Ruth Perry's school in Reading paid tribute to their late head teacher.
The clock in our school playground, which is our memorial for Ruth, reminds us every day of her presence and the impact she had on all our lives. She will forever be in our hearts.
The family say Ofsted changes don't go far enough. They say urgent lessons must be learnt from Mrs. Perry's death. Sadia Chowdhury, Sky News, at the Berkshire Coroner's Court in Reading.
Well, I'm joined now by Edmund Barnett-Ward. He is the parent of 4 children who all attended Caversham Primary School and who knew Ruth personally for more than a decade. Edmund, thank you so much for coming onto the UK tonight to talk to us.
Thank you, Sarah Jane. Thank you.
About the inquest verdict today. I know you feel this as someone who, you know, not only just had children at the school, but as someone who knew Ruth personally. Talk to me about how you're feeling today after the inquest results and that apology from Ofsted.
Well, I think it's the perfect mixture of desolation and vindication. So we've been saying now, every time this has been reported on, there's always been this caveat that it's the family that believe that she took her life because of the Ofsted inspection. We can now say without caveat that it was the Ofsted inspection that caused her to take her life. It's a terrible shame that we have to get to this point to start to begin to acknowledge that it's unacceptable to put teachers under this amount of stress. For us, this is one more step on the journey, but it's not the destination. So there's still a lot of work to go, and I welcome the comments that have been made this evening, but frankly, there was nothing at any point stopping Ofsted being introspective and looking at their practices and trying to learn lessons before this point. And the fact that it's taken a coroner's set of recommendations to even get to this point of forcing them in to do it is just abhorrent to me.
Edmund, talk to me about those next steps, because obviously I know that you've been working with Ruth's sister as well, who we heard from in that report there. You're doing this in Ruth's name. What are these next steps you want? What is next? What change do you want to see happen as a result of this?
All the way that we've been going along this process, we've been reacting to information that we had at the time. And the inquest itself has produced a large number of revelations. Obviously there are things to do with Ofsted systems that we couldn't possibly know. And clearly there is a huge issue with the way that they're training inspectors on how to recognise the signs of stress and to respond to the signs of stress. And to generally inspect in a more humane way. The next step for us, so you'll be aware that Amanda Spielman leaves post at the end of the year, and there's a new chief inspector that is coming in January, and Julia and I and another Reading head, Lisa Telling, who have been working with Julia. We've been working with Julia all year. are apparently the first people outside of Ofsted that he's actually going to go and meet with. So I'm looking forward to a constructive dialogue with him about what's wrong with his organisation.
And to make things better for teachers, because, Edmund, as you said there, it shouldn't have had to get to this point for there to be even talk about reform. But I think what we learned in that inquest is, you know, Ruth kept a diary, and I think it showed everyone just how much she as a head teacher cared. She wrote in that diary, you know, I don't believe any child would not have been safe at my school. She took this personally. You know, when Ofsted went back and reassessed the school, it wasn't inadequate, it was good. And just in that diary, it's the detail of what it's like as a teacher when Ofsted comes to inspect your school and how personally you take it. She wasn't necessarily worried about losing her job. She was worried about the children, worried about the school. Tell me more about Ruth and how she was as a head teacher, because I think we got a real sense of that from the inquest.
Yeah, Ruth was an exemplary head teacher. I mean, that's the reason I'm in this position today is because when this all started at the start of the year, I wanted to communicate to friends of mine about how devastated I felt and how what an amazing head she was, because I felt very upset that the narrative had been all about this single word label that had been slapped on her and the school of inadequate, and I needed to express what a brilliant school it was and what my personal experience was. So I'd sort of, as people do, took to social media. But friends said that I'd articulated how they felt probably better than they felt they could. So they asked me to make it public. And that's how Julia got in contact with me, because she happened to read this long post that I'd written about just different feelings to do with Ruth and school and what an amazing head she was. I mean, as you know, I've had 4 children go through the school. My youngest is still at the school. I've got a 14-year relationship with the school. I knew Ruth the entire time that she was a head, and she was just absolutely brilliant. She was one of those sort of sparkling lights in education that makes education interesting and fun. She had brilliant ideas, additional clubs that she ran, and all sorts of things that she did that just made it a wonderful, nurturing education environment. You know, you couldn't want better for your kids. I had a lousy school when I was young in comparison, and I've always said this. I'm so amazed, so lucky. Various of my kids have had issues. One of my kids is autistic. Several of my kids are dyslexic. There's never been any issue identifying those problems and helping and assisting, and they've all been set on their learning journey for the rest of their school careers with the most amazing foundation, the most amazing school. And that, you know, that's the person who I hold in such high esteem, whose legacy I want to protect, who I will carry on, you know, extolling the virtues of, and meanwhile trying to change this dreadful Ofsted system.
Well, look, Evan, thank you so much for coming on and paying tribute to Ruth tonight. You know, the world could do with more teachers like Ruth, and, you know, her legacy continues through the children that she taught and through your drive for change. So thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you, Sergio. Thank you.
Well, if you've been affected by the story of Ruth Perry, you can contact the Samaritans. They are on 116 123, or you can email them, joe@samaritans.org.
The new head of Ofsted says school inspectors will pause next Monday on the first anniversary of the death of Reading head teacher Ruth Perry to remember her. An inquest last month linked her suicide to a visit by inspectors to her school that resulted in it being downgraded from outstanding to inadequate. Sir Martin Oliver made his promise to Ruth's sister at the first meeting between Ofsted and the family this afternoon. Joe Campbell reports.
They've made this journey before. travelling to London to try and bring about change to the school's inspection system.
Even if that inspection had been conducted differently, with more empathy and compassion and all those words that they're using now, the effect would have been the same.
But this time things were different. This, the first meeting with Ofsted itself.
There is a little bit of me slightly anxious about entering that building, if I'm perfectly honest, all the associations, but I will certainly be pushing for real meaningful change, not just a little bit of training and a few tweaks to the current flawed system.
And they come prepared with what they hoped would be an agenda for change.
It's not about being nice human beings, it's about a system that works. There's no school that I know that thinks I'm just okay. They want to get better, but they want to get better in a supportive way where they feel that the job they're doing in a very, very challenging circumstances is the right thing, and keeping those people there is vitally important. Our system is very close to breaking.
But all this just another stage on the journey. Once inside the inspectorate's headquarter, the new chief inspector, Sir Martin Oliver, was there to meet them. He's already promised reforms. A 90-minute meeting eventually lasted 2 hours.
He started talking about the training that's starting next week, but he did say, I recognise that training starts on the anniversary of Ruth's death. And he looked genuinely quite emotional when saying that. And he says he's going to be addressing all the inspectors, and he will be asking for, a moment's silence and reflection on that, and making that link between this is why we're having the training.
After today's meeting, tomorrow it's the turn of the education unions. But perhaps the biggest task facing the new chief inspector is convincing Berkshire's coroner that there'll never be a case again like Ruth Perry's. Joe Campbell, BBC South Today, at the headquarters of Ofsted.
It is 8:41. Ofsted inspectors will hold a minute's silence for head teacher Ruth Perry during training around mental health. Mrs Perry, whose suicide was linked to an inspection by the education watchdog, died on the 8th of January last year. Her sister, Professor Julia Waters, met Ofsted head Sir Martin Oliver, who's just recently started in the job. She met him yesterday to discuss reforms in the organisation. She joins us now. Morning, Julia.
Morning.
So the new head of Ofsted, Sir Martin Oliver, told the BBC that the organisation's response to the death of your sister, Ruth Perry, didn't go far enough, and that inspectors need more training, which I imagine echoes your feeling.
I actually would like to take issue a bit with that. What Sir Martin Oliver has said, and we've been pushing for, is there needs to be really radical change, systemic change, cultural change at Ofsted. And this training is just the start. It's the first step of a whole programme of reform. So, I know that there are lots of teachers and head teachers and the teaching unions out there who are concerned that this is just a slight improvement on what's been offered so far. But I was reassured by Sir Martin yesterday that he understands that much more profound change is needed, and he plans to introduce such changes.
And do you feel that he listened to, because when we spoke before on this programme, you had a lot of thoughts about how those changes might be implemented, what those changes should be. Was he receptive to what you were saying?
Yes, he was. I was cautiously reassured by what he said. He is at least a former head teacher himself. Mm-hmm. As he's told me, he's been on the receiving end in one guise or another of 96 Ofsted inspections, both good and some really bad ones, which can happen. So he has a really profound first-hand experience of being on the receiving end of Ofsted inspections, and he assured me that he recognises the need to change, and that's actually why he wanted that very challenging role, to change Ofsted.
Is this the first meeting that anyone from your family has had with an Ofsted official since Ruth's death?
Apart from I had a very specific meeting with the regional director quite a few months after Ruth's death that I had asked for. Yes, it's the first meeting, the first time I've been in Ofsted, the first time we've had an opportunity to share our concerns with someone at Ofsted who's prepared to listen.
How did you feel going into Ofsted?
Sir Martin was sensitive enough to recognise that might be challenging for me and to offer an alternative venue. But he also was sensitive and encouraging enough for me to feel that I could go there. And I think it's important symbolically for me to go to Ofsted. Yet I did see a couple of people as I was walking through who I recognised from the inquest, which was not what I was expecting and not a pleasant reminder. But, I'm a grown-up. We've got to move on. You work in the system that's in place to try to change the system in place. And I was grateful for that invitation from Sir Martin.
In December, the Berkshire coroner, Heidi Connor, wrote to the inspectorate saying that without changes, there was a risk of future deaths among those subject to its inspections. Are you satisfied that enough changes will be made in order to mitigate that risk?
I'm not satisfied yet. I'm satisfied from my conversation yesterday with Sir Martin that he understands the extent of change that's needed, systemic and institutional cultural change. There's still a lot of people in Ofsted who refuse to see that something fundamentally wrong happened and that it was handled really, really badly. So Sir Martin has a challenge to change mindsets, to change personnel if necessary. But I'm, cautiously optimistic that he has the right attitude to the challenge. I'm hoping that the government will allow him to make the changes that are needed. Will recognise that things like the single word judgment and the high stakes consequences of a poor inspection will be addressed, that ideology won't come over the welfare of staff and students, preventing him from doing the changes that are absolutely desperately needed.
Now, Sir Martin, as I understand it, he wouldn't be able to change the one-word grading system himself, would he? That would have to come from the Department of Education. Yeah,
that was kind of what I was referring to there. I mean, it's a complex and not entirely satisfactory setup, really. Ofsted's relationship with government, with the Department for Education, is sort of autonomous but intimately interrelated. So yes, it is the DFE's, but in turn Number 10's decision would be to change those single word judgments. And there's a lot more than the single word judgment needs to change, a lot more. But that would be the one change that could be relatively, in my opinion, relatively easly changed and would make the biggest difference. And it's emblematic, yes. Yeah, it's emblematic of this kind of oversimplistic, introducing competition into a system that shouldn't be about competition, should be about improvement, should be about welfare, should be about education, for heaven's sake. It's emblematic of a kind of inappropriate business model being applied to public services generally, but to education, to children's welfare and education, and I just think it's wrong.
Are you going to continue meeting with Ofsted and Sir Martin over the coming months? Have you got any plans to do so?
Yes, he was very, he's not just open to it, he offered to. He's keen to continue to meet me and to meet others. I've suggested other people that I think he should meet, other head teachers who were forced by traumatic Ofsted inspections into similar situations to my sister and contemplated that awful wrong-headed act that she sadly took. So I think it's important that he hears firsthand, not just from me. I mean, I have very close experience of what an Ofsted inspection can do to someone, to a happy, healthy, successful head teacher. But he needs to hear that from head teachers who've been there, and he's very open to that and to having further meetings with me. I know he's meeting the unions today, I'm quite sure. I've been in contact with the NEHT over the last month. I'm sure they will echo my calls for reform and encourage him to have the bravery, integrity that are needed to push through the changes that are needed.
Have you, in the last year, have you spoken to a lot of head teachers who've had bad Ofsted experiences?
Hundreds. It's quite sobering. I mean, I was conscious, as sadly Ruth was. Ruth was not the first head teacher or teacher to take her life linked to an Ofsted inspection. But I was probably not aware of quite the extent. One of the advantages or disadvantages, if you like, of being an academic is people can Google me and they find my professional email. So it's been very easy for people to contact me. And hundreds. I'm sure I'll receive other emails today after this and other appearances. But the extent and the depth of the damage that's been done by Ofsted inspection over years is really staggering. It's a national disgrace, frankly, and it needs to be addressed.
How much time are you dedicating to this now?
It's been pretty much my full-time job for the last year. The Ruth's death has had a huge impact, as you can imagine, on me, on my family, on the broader community. I haven't really been able to work properly on my day job since her death, and I have been really quite consumed by this. But it's something. It's not a case of bringing good out of bad. I would do anything for Ruth to be here and leave the Ofsted inspection in the diabolical state it's in. Frankly, this isn't. This isn't something that is good in any way for my family. But if I can prevent other head teachers going through what Ruth went through, and if I can prevent other families going through what we are still going through, then at least that'll be something that I can feel I've achieved.
Thank you so much for talking to us. Really appreciate your time, Julia.
Thank you.
This is Radio 2. Jeremy Vine.
We will talk in just a moment about teaching inspections and whether Ruth Perry's sister believes they're really going to change. She joins us. Science questions with Dr. Chris Smith. He said he'll answer anything today. That's at 12:30. Then the criminal who gets out of jail but has wrecked your life, how you deal with that. And then also laser pointers. Now, you remember we've spoken on this programme before about the tragic story of Ruth Perry, the head teacher of Caversham Primary School, who took her own life following a negative inspection by Ofsted, the school's inspector. During the inquest into Mrs. Perry's death, the coroner heard how she'd been reduced to tears in meetings with the lead inspector during Ofsted's visit in November 2022. While awaiting the publication of a report that was going to downgrade her school from outstanding to the lowest rating of inadequate, Ruth took her own life. Last month, a coroner concluded that the Ofsted inspection had contributed to her suicide and said it lacked fairness, respect and sensitivity and was at times rude and intimidating. Ofsted say changes are coming, with the new head, Sir Martin Oliver, pausing inspections until later this month while staff receive training on how to spot signs of stress among teachers during school visits. Inspectors will also hold a minute's silence for Mrs. Perry during training around mental health. Well, earlier this week, Mrs. Perry's sister, Julia Waters, met the Ofsted head to discuss reforms in the organisation, and I'm pleased to say she's here with me so she can tell us how she feels it's going with Ofsted. But we'd love your views, whether you're a teacher or a parent or even an inspector. Do get in touch by texting 88291. You can send us a WhatsApp message on 08000 288 291, or you can email vine@bbc.co.uk with your phone number so we can get back to you. So, Professor Julia Waters, hello.
Hello.
Thank you for coming in, and I guess this takes us all back to the moment this all happened.
Yeah, which will be a year on Monday. Well, a year on Monday will be the anniversary of Ruth's death, but clearly it was 54 days before that the disastrous inspection took place.
And we know a lot more about it now. We know the name of the inspector. We know some of the things he did. There was apparently some sniggering during the inspection. There was a mocking tone. When this all came out during the inquest, what did you think?
Well, I knew this already, of course. Ruth had spoken to me in depth. So I think, lots of people have said, what was the impact of the inquest on me? In a way, the overriding feeling was validation that the coroner could recognise what we had known already, but that Ofsted in particular had been reluctant to admit in defending their indefensible system. But what I would say, although, yes, many media have picked up on that point about how the inspection was conducted, and there were appalling behaviours during that inspection, that's not all that contributed, and again I pick up on that word about contributed to Ruth's death. That's a legal term for saying it caused it in my term, and the inquest itself was very clear on that. The witnesses were asked by the coroner, do you see that there was a direct link between that inspection and Ruth's death? And all the witnesses said yes, categorically.
Didn't her GP give evidence that she'd not been to him at all before for anything mental health related?
Absolutely. She had no history of mental health problems. She was remarkably resilient, happy, healthy, successful. There was no other issue beyond, the everyday stress of being a head teacher, which any head teachers and teachers listening will understand. But she was very competent, she was well regarded, she was very experienced, and it was the shock and the utter injustice of that inspection that precipitated her decline. And then, on top of that, the long wait, the confidentiality requirement, the threat of public humiliation, the threat of losing her job. She had no assurance that she would be able to keep her job or a job in education at all, with an inadequate judgment. However flimsy the so-called evidence, the automatic next move is forced academisation, and usually the loss of at least the head teacher's job. Right. So she had all of that added to that original shock, and yes, the appalling behaviour of inspectors as well.
When the inspector, Alan Derry, was questioned, I think with quite a lot of detail, he was asked, look, you could see that Ruth Perry was distressed. Shouldn't you have paused the inspection? And his reply was, no, not at all. There was a major safeguarding concern around the safeguarding of children, and this needed to be immediately addressed and safely addressed. What was your reaction to that when you heard that?
That was yet another example that went on throughout the inquest of Ofsted trying to play the trump card of safeguarding. And the former chief inspector has done this herself repeatedly on air, on national media, claiming that there were major safeguarding issues. As the inquest proved, the disclosure evidence proved what I knew already. There were absolutely minor sort of record-keeping issues. The lead inspector had said to the chair of governors during the inspection that the school had a robust culture of safeguarding. Children were not at risk, but picked up on gaps in paperwork, minutes from meetings that hadn't been uploaded in time, and so on. So although the coroner had explicitly said that she was not going to look at whether that judgment was appropriate or not, and for very sound reasons didn't want to go into discussing the so-called evidence because it could identify children, and that in itself was a safeguarding issue, Ofsted kept coming back and trying to imply that there were serious problems there. But again, the evidence says, and the coroner picked up on this, that the issues that were identified around safeguarding paperwork could have been put right before the report came out.
So we go to the present day. Ofsted's got a new head now, Sir Martin Oliver. They say changes are coming. They've paused inspection until later this month. The staff are getting training on how to spot signs of stress among teachers during school visits. They're going to hold a minute's silence for your sister's death. While they train around mental health. There's a whole load of stuff being done. And the key question, Julia, today is whether you think it's going to be enough.
Well, I had a very open, frank and helpful meeting with Sir Martin yesterday. About 2.5 hours we were in there, and he listened. He seemed he is a former head teacher himself, so he gets it. He's been on the receiving end, I think he said, of 96 Ofsted inspections. So he knows what it feels like to be inspected. And he made it very clear to me, and I will be pushing him on that the training that's starting on Monday is just the start of a process. The training that starts on Monday will at least now actually involve both him as the chief inspector, but also mental health experts, specialists. So not just the complete lip service online training that was provided previously. So it does sound as though the training is more rigorous. But as I said to him, and as he understood, it's not enough just to teach inspectors to be decent human beings. The inspectors at Ruth's school identified that Ruth was clearly very distressed, but they ploughed on regardless. So it's not a matter of just identifying stress. It's what is absolutely urgent and crucial is that the system that causes that stress is reformed, that we prevent such catastrophic and widespread stress from happening in the first place. Ruth wasn't the first head or teacher to take her own life because of an Ofsted inspection, and I have been contacted by hundreds, literally hundreds of teachers, head teachers, relatives, colleagues of teachers who well, frankly, are putting a lot of responsibility on my shoulders, are pinning a lot of hope on Ofsted reform, who've had horribly traumatic experiences and understand only too well how damaging an inspection and a one-word judgment can be.
Now, that's what I wanted to ask you. A one-word judgment. So your sister was faced with being told her school was, one word, inadequate. We gather from the inquest, I think her husband gave evidence that she was then thinking she might be blamed for a fall in house prices in the area. That's how big that word was for her. Are you thinking that's at the heart of this problem, is that it shouldn't be a one-word judgment?
The one-word judgment is the most obvious, sort of emblematic problem with a system that is flawed through and through. There are multiple psychologically damaging flaws in the current system, but a lot of those hinge on that single word judgment. The idea that provides, simplicity, clarity, it's misleading. It can never, even the outstanding judgment, this Ruth school was outstanding previously. That's a huge weight on a head teacher's shoulders to keep that going. And it's always, one word is always inaccurate and can never reflect the complexities of a school. But when you think, in addition to that it's oversimplistic, misrepresentative, misleading, you have a word like inadequate. In a context like education, I work in education, I would never, ever get away with marking one undergraduate essay and putting inadequate at the bottom to sum it up. It's a damaging term, but it's also, it's far too simplistic and dangerous.
Thank you so much for coming in and talking to us, Professor Julia Waters, who is the sister of head teacher Ruth Perry, who took her own life while waiting for an Ofsted report to be published. Listening to that was Branwen Jeffries, the BBC's education editor. Branwen, starting with the last point first, do you think we will get away from one-word judgments?
Well, at the moment, there's no indication that the current government wants to move away from single-word judgments for schools or one- or two-word judgments for schools. That's partly something that sits within the Department for Education, but also more widely across government, because it's how we judge everything now. It's the similar grading system is used for hospitals, for care homes, for prisons, and so it's something that runs across the public sector. So to date, the government has signalled it's not likely to move. Labour have said, and actually had said before the death of Ruth Perry came into the public domain, that they want to move to more of a report card system which looks at the pros and cons of a school. This is where you're strong, this is where you need to improve. And we're waiting, Jeremy, for a report from MPs, which will come out at some point in the next few weeks, who have separately had an inquiry into how Ofsted is working with schools. And this is one of the key issues that came up time and again in the evidence they heard from many different people during their inquiry.
But surely there will be at some point some pushback from parents who say, wait, we as parents haven't got time to wade through a 20-page report. We need a really clear judgment, and sometimes that will involve a hard truth. Not suggesting, by the way, that's the case with Ruth Perry's school.
So I think there is, of course, an absolute imperative that where you have public money being spent and children involved, that there has to be outside scrutiny as to whether or not they're being kept safe and is their education meeting at least the acceptable minimum standards that everyone has a right to accept. And I actually don't think anyone is disputing that, not Ruth Perry's family, nor any of the education unions. It's about the how and whether or not you can fully capture a school. And actually, the coroner, Heidi Connor, who's the senior coroner for Berkshire, who heard all the evidence around Ruth Perry's death, she has issued a formal Prevent Future Deaths report. Now, that's something that's got a statutory legal standing. It's separate from the inquest verdict. It's gone to the government, to the local council, and also to Ofsted, in which she says there is a risk of further future deaths unless we do something about this system. And at the heart of that report, she puts a scenario. You've got School A, where everything is absolutely marvellous, but there's some failings in safeguarding and record keeping that can be fixed pretty quickly and straightforwardly with a bit of advice and help. The Caversham example, if you like. And at the same time, you've got School B, where everything is dreadful and clearly there needs to be intervention. And they get treated at the moment exactly in the same way. And so she, as a coroner, is raising questions about, if you have something that is fixable, is this the right way to go, compared with a school where clearly anyone coming in from the outside and looking at it might think there were multiple failings. And of course, there has to be a way to intervene. And it's the consequences that we know weighed very heavily on Ruth Perry's mind about the impact on the local community, the impact, as you mentioned, on house prices, the impact for her, essentially the end of a very successful teaching and head teaching career.
Thank you very much, Branwen Jeffers, BBC Education Editor. And before Branwen, it was Julia Waters, who's the sister of Ruth Perry. We'd love your thoughts. We'll play some music first, but we'd love your thoughts on whether Ofsted is not quite doing enough to show it's changed.